In the beginning, the Norman Conquest of England in 1066 was just one in a series of invasions. It started when the forces of the Roman Emperor Claudius arrived in 43 CE. They finally left in 409 CE as their empire crumbled. Britannia, as it was called by the Romans, sank into the period known as the Dark Ages. By the middle of the 5th century, the anglo-saxons, Germanic peoples who had arrived after the Romans, were dominant. During this time, England was not a single entity, but a collection of 7 kingdoms. The most prominent were Mercia and Wessex. The lure of riches and land attracted Viking raiders from Scandinavia, beginning in 793. That year, the wealthy Lindisfarne Monastery in Northumbria was pillaged. There were annual coastal raids for years after that. In 865, the great heathen army from Denmark invaded in a bid to take over 4 kingdoms. They captured the northern city of York, or Jorvik, making it their capital. It became the second largest city outside of London. By the end of the 9th century, King Alfred of Wessex had soundly defeated the Vikings. They settled in eastern England, an area known as the Danelaw. The majority Anglo-Saxon population lived south of that line. Why it all happened, the main players. And this brings us to 1066. In early January, the Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, died childless. Immediately, there were several claims to his throne. Some had stronger claims than others, but all were willing to go to war for the crown. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was Edward's brother-in-law and had been the Shadow King for many years. He took care of all the royal duties Edward didn't care to. His father, Godwin, had provided the same service when Edward came to the throne in 1042, after many years of exile in Normandy. He had fled there as a child to escape Danish invasions of England. On his deathbed, January 5, 1066, it is believed that Edward appointed Harold as his heir. Harold wasn't of royal blood and was only connected to Edward by marriage, but he was an Anglo-Saxon, well-liked and trusted by the people, who got the immediate approval of the Witan, the council responsible for making all key decisions in the kingdom. Harold was crowned the very next day. Meanwhile, in northern France, William, the Duke of Normandy, watched with increasing rage. Only 2 years before, Harold Godwinson had sworn his support for William's claim to the throne, a promise made under duress since Harold had been William's captive at the time. William reasoned that his claim was the most legitimate, even though it was widely believed it wasn't. He was the bastard son of Robert I of Normandy. His link to the English royal family came through Edward the Confessor's mother, Emma of Normandy. Her father was William's paternal grandfather. So, William claimed that as a cousin of the late king, he had a right to the throne. As the only son, William inherited his father's dukedom at the tender age of 7. By adulthood, he had proven to be a tactical and brutal leader. He had feuds with surrounding dukes, even the King of France, Henry I, who had been a former ally. Ambition burned brightly within him. The last contender had the weakest claim, King Harald Hardrada of Norway. He was encouraged to make a bid for the crown by Tostig Godwinson, the estranged brother of the new English king. Complicated political maneuverings in England and Scandinavia had followed the death in 1035 of Edward's stepfather, Knut, King of England, Denmark, and Norway. Hardrada made his claim based on those machinations, and with Tostig's help, he mounted an invasion force. The invasion begins, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold Hardrada left Norway in August, collecting allies and men in Shetland and Orkney, before meeting up with Tostig Godwinson on the northeast coast on September 8th. Harold had up to 15,000 men and almost 300 longships, dwarfing Tostig's much smaller force of only 12 ships. King Harold Godwinson was readying to meet the expected invasion from the south by William of Normandy. However, as September approached, he had to let many of his soldiers go as they were needed to gather the harvest. Learning that the Norse army had not only landed but also captured York, King Harold gathered his men. He made the journey from London to Yorkshire in 4 days. Hardrada, who was waiting for supplies at Stamford Bridge, was caught completely off guard by the English on September 25th. The exact location of the battlefield is unknown, but local lore sets it east of the River Derwent and southeast of Stamford Bridge in an area called Battle Flats. At the start, the Norwegians were divided in two by the river. As the two armies met, the Vikings on the western side of the river were either killed or fled across the bridge. The Norse then formed a shield wall to meet the oncoming English. The battle raged for hours. Eventually, the English troops were able to force their way through the Norse defenses. Outflanked and with both Hardrada and Tostig dead, the Norwegians were practically wiped out. It is said that some 50 years after the battle, the bleached bones of the dead still lay exposed. The Battle of Hastings. By August 1066, William had the support of key French nobles, as well as the Pope. The exact number of troops raised varies from 7,000 to 12,000, depending on the source. After waiting 8 weeks for favorable winds, the invasion force landed at Pevensey Bay in Sussex on September 28th. Fresh from his Stamford Bridge victory, King Harold hurried from Yorkshire with 7,000 men behind him to face the Norman army. On October 14th, the two sides met near Hastings. Harold initially had the advantage, mustering his troops at the top of a hill. Forming a shield wall, they first faced William's archers, then his spearmen, followed by cavalry. The Normans failed to make any headway. When a rumor started that William had been killed, there was panic, and some of his soldiers turned tail and ran. It wasn't until William showed his face that peace was restored to his army, prompting a new strategy. The Normans tricked the English into thinking that they were in retreat, then turning around to attack their pursuers. Late in the battle, Harold was killed by an infamous arrow in the eye, according to the Bayeux Tapestry. The death of Harold spelled the end for the English. Although William had won decisively, it did not stop the Witan from electing Edgar Atheling as king. The 15-year-old was the last male heir of the House of Wessex. Although never crowned, he was involved in at least one of the rebellions that sprung up in the early years of William's reign. The harrying of the North Campaign saw William deploy scorched earth tactics to brutally put down resistance in early 1070. William was crowned in London at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. He ruled until 1087 and oversaw many changes in the English way of life. The legacy of the Norman Conquest. William's decisive victory led to the final breaking of ties with Scandinavia. England, unwillingly, was now brought closer to the influence of France and Western Europe. The new king embarked on a campaign of castle building to control the countryside. Norman barons replaced Anglo-Saxon nobles, and each became responsible for building a castle on their lands. William introduced the feudal system of land tenure. The barons provided land in exchange for loyalty, military service, and, of course, taxes. The barons, in turn, rented land to their knights, who divided it amongst the peasants, who did all the work to generate the tax money. This pyramid-like scheme worked if everyone remained loyal to the king, who was the only true landowner in the kingdom. Anglo-Saxon England already had well-developed government and legal systems before the conquest. These systems continued to be upheld, but the courts introduced Norman trials by combat for criminal cases. Also, legal proceedings could now call for witnesses to give sworn testimony. The church hierarchy was reorganized, with most high-ranking Anglo-Saxon officials being replaced by Norman bishops and abbots. William also encouraged the founding of monasteries, including Battle Abbey in Hastings, to mark his victory over Harold. The Domesday Book helped William understand the true picture of wealth in his new kingdom. Over the space of a year, one team of surveyors traveled the length and breadth of England, determining the worth of people's farms and animals. A second team then combed through the results for accuracy. The book exists today as a valued historical reference. And lastly, not enough can be said of the influence the Norman Conquest had on the English language. With the court and nobles speaking French, it was only expected that there would be a trickle-down effect. Words like pork, beef, law, and royal entered the language. Some place names like Chapel en la Firth, Ashby de la Zouche, or family names like Beauchamp, which became Beauchamp, or Vernon appeared. The Norman influence is still felt to this day in England, as well as in many of the countries which were part of the former British Empire.